Hello everyone, I'm Alex Russo and I'm a science fiction and fantasy author. Today I'm going to be discussing how to make relevant fantasy people will want to read and how to shift the paradigm in the genre. So, what do I mean when I say relevant? Well, many will point you to the zeitgeist, which are tropes readers want to experience in their story. I also want to point you in new directions. In addition to explaining what zeitgeist is in this presentation, I want to tell you how to incorporate non-zeitgeist related concerns into your story, inspire you to try something novel in your story, pun partially intentional there, and push boundaries in a good way, as well as recasting old tropes in a new light. In the arts, zeitgeist is what consumers want to have in a book, film, TV show, or video game. It includes tropes, story arcs, and moods or themes. While zeitgeist can help you in the short term to sell more creative works, it does change every few years. However, this presentation is not focused on zeitgeist. If you want to learn more about what a zeitgeist is and learn about some general shifts in literary zeitgeist in recent years, I have attached a couple of videos in the description below. So, one way you can write relevant fantasy is by including other aspects of pop culture or society that are relevant at the time. One of the best examples of this I've seen in recent years is the novel Starlighter by Brian Davis. While I'm not a fan of Brian Davis's companion book to this novel, I would absolutely recommend the original book to fantasy writers. While Starlighter is on the verge of science fantasy because it has dragons come from another planet and the natives of the human world have near future levels of technology, I would say reading this would be useful to fantasy writers in more conservative subgenres such as epic fantasy. Because of the contrast between sci-fi and medieval technology in the world of the story, it sets up narratives about science versus magic and the difficulties that arise when magic or the supernatural is attempted to be explained in scientific terms. There is also a debate that reminds me of that between evolutionism and creationism in this story. While it doesn't use those terms, it focuses on the origins of a human colony on the Dragon Planet. Moreover, this story handles aspects of contemporary society that are peripheral in most fiction. Because Brian Davis employed these tropes, I believe this is what caused me and several other readers to enjoy the book so much. So, when you're writing fantasy that is relevant, try to incorporate some aspects of the culture of that time in order to create a realistic feel to the story. Along the lines of focusing on current events, I would suggest that fantasy writers try something new. For example, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series and Brian Jacobs' Redwall series became beloved series within the genre because of their uniqueness. Starting off with the Wheel of Time, Jordan fused tropes that were common in Western fantasy with certain elements of Asian mythology and fantasy literature, a move that was unheard of at the time. Additionally, when researching the content for this presentation, I saw that Robert Jordan originally planned to have the protagonist of The Wheel of Time be an elderly man who found out he was the chosen one, but scraped it because it couldn't fit into the story. While Jordan was unable to get this trope to work, it may work for your story depending on your needs. Furthermore, Jordan introduced unique ideas about magic systems in fantasy societies to make his novels stand out, such as that women can only wield magic responsibly, and that even magic that was once good can be corrupted by evil forces. Cycling back to the Eastern influences, the Wheel of Time incorporates a cyclical history pattern instead of linear history, recalling the creation of the Earth according to Indian mythology and religion. Next off we have Redwall. While it uses old tropes such as anthropomorphic animals, medieval stasis, and an Excalibur-like quest in the first novel, it applies these tropes in unique ways. Jacobs developed a unique style of writing, as his first audience was tailored towards blind children. As a result, he describes everything in elaborate detail. Continuing on to characters, the cast of the Redwall series is composed entirely of animals instead of fantasy creatures and humans like other fantasy books of the same length. Lastly, I want to include that Redwall took a more agnostic approach to the paranormal and magic when compared to other fantasy series. While divine intervention does appear from time to time, most books usually depict the supernatural as a hoax by cunning individuals to exert their power. So, when you write your fantasy story, don't be afraid to try something new. It can breathe fresh life into the genre and can give you a niche that will attract readers. Along the lines of trying something new, it's okay to push or even bend the proverbial envelope. For an example of this, let's look at J.R.R. Tolkien's three primary works, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. While each one contributes to the world of Middle-earth, they each can be read on their own and have their own unique features. For example, The Hobbit has the feel of many fairy tales. Bilbo Baggins goes on a quest to fight a literal dragon and then returns to the Shire, completing the hero's journey. However, in The Lord of the Rings, the themes and moods are tailored for a more mature audience and introduce more complex character and story arcs. Concluding with The Silmarillion, it takes on a more mythological tone. As passages are brief, it is written in a style similar to religious texts, and it exhibits biblical allegory through the creation of Middle-earth and the discussion about the spiritual forces that were at play in its early days. Additionally, Tolkien created the genre of epic fantasy, also known as high fantasy, when he wrote these books. Before their advent, fantasy was mainly restricted to folklore, fairy tales, and mythology. However, after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, people began to treat fantasy like it was worthy of appreciation, like other genres such as mystery, horror, or early science fiction. Moreover, while complex world-building and conlings existed before Lord of the Rings, Tolkien popularized these ideas through thorough craftsmanship, causing them to be necessary for contemporary fantasy and inspiring similar movements in science fiction. So, when you create something new, try to rock the boat in a constructive way, similar to how Tolkien did with his books about Middle-earth. Finally, you could also just recast old tropes in a new light. What I mean by this is not reusing old tropes and arcs from other stories, but following the advice of S.D. Smith. When Smith wrote the highly successful novel, The Green Ember, he wanted to write a new story with an old soul, in his words. He explains this on his website as taking old virtues and morals, then weaving them into the fabric of his books. As a result, he accomplishes the same goals C.S. Lewis, Aesop, Tolkien, and Brian Davis accomplished while creating something new entirely. And his story speaks for itself. Because there is a high demand for juvenile literature that is epic while being legitimately wholesome, he ended up filling this niche with his books. It was the #1 best-selling audiobook on Audible a few years back, has spawned several spin-off series and standalone novels, and is now receiving a video game adaptation to an upcoming novel. In short, it has become the spiritual successor to Redwall and Narnia. So, when creating relevant fantasy, try to look at recasting old tropes in a new light to attract readers. This is important because these old tropes tend to be common throughout many stories, and there will always be a market for them. That is all I have for today. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to make a magic system for your fantasy story, or learn how to craft realistic characters, here's a video on magic systems and a playlist about character development.